Late-night diners have a charm of their own. The hum of fluorescent lights, the clinking of coffee cups, and the occasional murmur of a jukebox create an atmosphere that feels both comforting and eerie. For many, these places are a refuge, a spot to grab a bite, sip on coffee, and escape the world for a while. But for one diner employee, a seemingly ordinary night turned into a chilling encounter that would haunt her for years to come. It was a quiet Tuesday night at a small roadside diner. The kind of place where regulars came for their late-night coffee and truckers stopped for a quick bite. Sarah, a college student working the night shift, was used to the slow hours. She enjoyed the solitude, using the time to study between serving the occasional customer. The diner was her safe haven, a place where she could focus on her textbooks and dream of a future far away from the sleepy little town. But that night, something felt off. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 a.m. when the bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer. Sarah looked up from her textbook to see a man walk in. He was tall, with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to scan the room with an unsettling intensity. His long coat hung loosely on his frame, and he carried a small battered suitcase. Without a word, he slid into the booth in the far corner of the diner, the one furthest from the counter. Sarah greeted him with a polite smile and walked over with a menu. "Good evening. Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" she asked. The man didn't respond at first. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. After a moment of silence, he finally muttered, "Coffee. Black." She nodded, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. As she poured his coffee, she couldn't help but glance at him. He sat perfectly still, his suitcase placed carefully on the seat beside him. Something about him felt wrong. But Sarah reminded herself not to judge. After all, working the night shift meant encountering all kinds of people, some friendly, some strange, and some just tired from long journeys. When she brought the coffee to his table, he didn't thank her. Instead, he stared into the cup, as if lost in thought. Sarah returned to the counter, trying to focus on her studies, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Every time she glanced in his direction, his eyes seemed to follow her, unblinking. It wasn't the first time she'd dealt with odd customers, but there was something about this man that made her skin crawl. Minutes turned into an hour, and the man didn't order anything else. He just sat there, occasionally sipping his coffee. The diner was empty, except for him, and the silence was deafening. Sarah's unease grew with each passing moment. She considered asking him if he needed anything else, but something about his demeanor made her hesitate. Instead, she busied herself with cleaning the counter and refilling the sugar dispensers, anything to keep her mind occupied. At one point, she noticed something strange. The man hadn't touched his suitcase since he arrived, but now it was slightly open. From her vantage point, she could see the edge of what looked like a photograph sticking out. Curiosity got the better of her, and she tried to get a closer look without being obvious. The photo appeared to be of a young woman, smiling brightly. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The woman in the photo looked eerily familiar. Suddenly, the man stood up, startling Sarah. He grabbed his suitcase and walked toward the door. For a moment, she felt relief, thinking he was finally leaving. But as he reached the door, he stopped and turned to look at her. His piercing gaze sent a shiver through her. "You remind me of her," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Before she could respond, he walked out into the night, the bell jingling behind him. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding. Who was the woman in the photo? And why did he say she reminded him of her? She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just narrowly escaped something terrible. The next day, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the man. She decided to mention the encounter to her manager, hoping for some reassurance. To her surprise, her manager's face went pale. "That sounds like the guy from a story I heard years ago," he said. "A man used to come here late at night, always sitting in the same booth. He carried a suitcase with a photo of his fiancée. She disappeared decades ago, and he's been searching for her ever since." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Was it the same man, or was it just a coincidence? She never saw him again, but every time she worked the night shift, she couldn't help but glance at the booth in the corner, half expecting to see him sitting there, staring into his coffee. Weeks passed, and Sarah tried to put the encounter behind her. But one night, as she was closing up the diner, she noticed something strange. The booth where the man had sat was empty, but there was a faint outline of a coffee cup on the table, as if someone had been sitting there recently. The bell above the door hadn't jingled, and the diner had been locked for hours. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she quickly finished cleaning and left for the night. Over time, Sarah began to hear more stories about the man. Regulars at the diner spoke in hushed tones about a mysterious figure who would appear late at night, always sitting in the same booth. Some claimed he was a ghost, forever searching for his lost love. Others believed he was just a drifter with a tragic past, but no one could explain why he seemed to vanish without a trace. Years later, long after Sarah had left the diner and moved on with her life, she still thought about the man. She wondered if he was still out there, wandering from diner to diner, searching for something or someone he would never find. And every time she passed a roadside diner late at night, she couldn't help but glance inside, half expecting to see him sitting in the corner booth, staring into his coffee. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, but Sarah knew one thing for sure: she would never forget the late-night stranger in the booth. Roadside diners have always been a staple of late-night travelers, offering a warm meal, a cup of coffee, and a brief respite from the long, lonely highways. But some diners carry stories that go beyond the ordinary. Stories that linger in the minds of those who hear them, leaving behind a chill that's hard to shake. This is one such story, a tale of a waitress who vanished without a trace, leaving behind more questions than answers. It was the kind of diner you'd expect to find on a desolate stretch of highway. A neon, open 24 hours sign buzzed faintly in the window, and the parking lot was often empty except for a few trucks and the occasional car. The staff was small, just a handful of waitresses and a cook who worked in shifts to keep the place running around the clock. Among them was a young woman named Emily, a cheerful and hard-working waitress who had been with the diner for a little over a year. Emily was well-liked by the regulars. She had a warm smile and a knack for remembering orders, even for customers she hadn't seen in months. She worked the late shift most nights, preferring the quiet hours when the diner was less crowded. But one night, Emily's shift took a turn that no one could have predicted. It was a cold autumn evening, and the diner was unusually quiet. Emily was the only waitress on duty, and the cook, a gruff but kind man named Joe, was in the kitchen preparing for the night's orders. Around midnight, a man walked in. He was tall and thin, with a pale complexion and dark circles under his eyes. He wore a long coat and carried a small leather bag. Emily greeted him with her usual warmth and handed him a menu. The man didn't say much. He ordered a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily noticed that he seemed nervous, glancing around the diner, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. She tried to make small talk, but he didn't respond, so she left him alone and returned to the counter. As the hours passed, a few more customers trickled in, truckers looking for a quick meal and a couple on a road trip. Emily served them all with her usual efficiency, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man in the corner booth hadn't touched his pie, and his coffee had gone cold. He just sat there, staring out the window into the darkness. Around 2 a.m., the diner was empty again, except for the man. Emily was wiping down the counter when he suddenly stood up and walked toward the door. He paused for a moment, turned to look at her and said, "Be careful out there." His voice was low and filled with an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. Before she could respond, he walked out into the night, leaving his untouched pie and coffee behind. Emily shook off the strange encounter and went back to her work. The rest of the night was uneventful, and by the time her shift ended at 6 a.m., she was ready to go home. She said goodbye to Joe, grabbed her coat, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. But Emily never made it home. When her roommate woke up later that morning, she noticed that Emily's bed hadn't been slept in. Concerned, she called the diner, but Joe said Emily had left hours ago. Her car was still in the parking lot, and there was no sign of her anywhere. The police were called and a search was launched, but no trace of Emily was ever found. The disappearance shocked the small community. Emily had no known enemies, no reason to run away, and no history of mental illness. Her friends and family were devastated, and the regulars at the diner couldn't believe that someone so full of life could simply vanish. As the weeks turned into months, rumors began to spread. Some people claimed to have seen Emily walking along the highway late at night, her figure illuminated by the headlights of passing cars. Others said they had spotted her inside the diner, sitting in the corner booth where the strange man had been that night. But every time someone tried to approach her, she would disappear. The most chilling account came from a trucker who stopped at the diner late one night about a year after Emily's disappearance. He claimed that a young waitress with a warm smile had served him coffee and pie. She had introduced herself as Emily and even chatted with him about his route. But when he mentioned her to the cook, the man's face went pale. "That's impossible," he said. "Emily's been missing for a year." The trucker insisted that it was her, describing her appearance and even the way she spoke. But when the cook checked the security footage, there was no sign of Emily. The trucker had been sitting alone the entire time. Over the years, the story of Emily's disappearance became a local legend. Some believed she had been abducted, while others thought she had run away to start a new life. But those who worked at the diner had their own theory. They believed that Emily had never left the diner at all, that her spirit was still there, serving coffee and pie to late-night travelers, just as she had done in life. To this day, the diner remains open, and the staff occasionally hears strange noises late at night. Plates clatter in the kitchen when no one is there, and the faint sound of footsteps echoes through the empty dining room. Some say they've seen a figure in the corner booth, a young woman with a warm smile who vanishes the moment you look away. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain. The story of Emily, the vanishing waitress, is one that will haunt the diner, and those who hear it, for years to come.